Financial Sense Tuesday edition with Jim Poplava. Featuring experts on the economy and investing and looking at the bigger picture.
Hey, John.
Hello, Jim. How are you?
Hey, pretty good. I'll tell you where I want to go today. I had Alan Simpson on the program last week, and he was co-chair of the President's Deficit Reduction Commission.
Okay.
And basically, I don't know if you ever saw his press conference, but he said we gored so many oxes that he asked to be put in the witness protection program. But he basically said there is no way we're going to get this thing under control unless we go after entitlements. But yet in New York, a Republican just lost because they went after the Republican with Metascare.
Yep.
And John, you know these numbers better than I do. I'm putting together a presentation. I just looked at the numbers. You've got 80%. It's like there's no way out for these guys.
Unfortunately, that's the case.
Yeah.
I mean, Simpson's absolutely correct. There's no way of bringing the deficit under control and restoring fiscal balance in the United States without massive cuts to both Social Security and Medicare. And I think it's possible for that to happen, and that's one reason that I, fortunately, am looking at a hyperinflation. See, I don't see any practical way out of it.
Yeah, because there's three ways that is typically used to get yourself out of a financial pickle. One, you can grow your way out. I think it's obvious at this point we're not going to be able to do that. The numbers are so big.
Right.
Number two, you can default on it, and countries have, like Russia, Argentina. Or three, you do something, you just print your way out of it, and the numbers are so big. The thing that I don't understand, John, do you think these guys just think that they can just keep kicking the can down the road? Do they not understand the implications of what they're doing?
Well, I think they fully understand the implications of what they're doing. They're just trying to kick it far enough down the road that maybe something will come along to save them, or they're not going to be around to take the blame for it. They don't want it to happen now. We saw that happen. We saw that circumstance back in 2008, where you had the system on the brink of collapse, a collapse of the banking system. And that would have been a very different scenario than what we're looking at here. There was talk then of a Great Depression, a Great Deflation like you had in the 1930s. The reason you had that deflation in the 1930s was that the money supply collapsed along with the banking system. And when I say the banking system, you had a number of bank failures where individuals lost the deposits they had with the bank. The bank went out of business. You had your money with the bank. You no longer had your money. That money disappeared from the money supply. In September of 2008, the system was faced with effectively a global run on the banking system. And backup guarantees from the federal government with the FDIC and such. And whether or not they would have stepped in to fund the FDIC, having let everything else fail, remains to be seen. I mean, it never got that far, but instead what they did was they started creating and spending whatever money they had to create in order to prevent the systemic collapse. And as it became clear that more was needed, they guaranteed not only the $100,000 in a bank account, but they went beyond that. They guaranteed mutual funds. They guaranteed whatever they had to do. They promised whatever they had to promise to keep the system from collapsing. That's the nature of the beast here. They can't let the system collapse. If they do, it's an outright failure for the Fed. It's an outright failure for the federal government, and it sure is not going to be a happy time for the average American. The problem is that what brought the system to that crisis is still in play. The systemic solvency issues have not been resolved. The economy has not been restored. And you have in place a basic long-term insolvency for the United States. Had the crisis back in 2007, 2008 not broken, they might have been able to kick the can down the road towards the end of the current decade. But the way they responded to the crisis, the way they're handling things now, has brought in the time limit significantly. I don't see us getting beyond 2014 without our getting into a hyperinflation. They have opted for the inflation. That's the action they've taken to do what they're doing the ultimate price here is inflation. And, it would have been easier maybe to bring things under control back in the 1980s, but they didn't do that. It's too late to moan and groan over that at this point. Going forward, could the system be brought into balance? Technically, it probably could. It would be extremely painful, well beyond what's been popularly talked about. And you look at all the political hoopla that's come out of just minor changes or suggestions of minor changes. Again, it's my contention that politically it's an impossible circumstance to resolve at this point in time. People will tend to move to correct things when they start feeling severe financial pain. But in the case here, once you start feeling the severe financial pain, it's going to be too late to correct it. You're going to be heading into the hyperinflation.
John, and maybe I'm going to be a little sympathetic with the politicians. When they conduct a political poll, they go, what's the number one problem? Everybody says the budget deficit, the debt. Then when they drill down and say, well, would you be in favor of cutting this or cutting that? And then it gets down where there's very little support. It's okay to cut somebody else's program, go tax somebody else. And so we just saw a political race in New York where, basically the candidate one side was demonized as wanting to throw. In fact, they ran political ads of a guy that looked like Paul Ryan taking grandma in a wheelchair and pushing her off a cliff.
Yeah.
And you and I know we're in a presidential election cycle. This president doesn't have any stomach to cut spending. And
it's terrible the way things are handled here. I mean, the type of talk you hear reminds me of the type of propaganda that came out of Great Britain at the outbreak of World War I, claiming that the Germans were bayoneting and eating Belgian babies. I mean, that's nonsense, but that's the type of rhetoric that you're getting, and it's nonsense. It's not the type of thing that's going to resolve the issue here. What you need is someone running the system, Congress, the president, people who are willing to do what has to be done. They don't care about the polls. They're willing to take a one-term stint in office if that's the cost of doing what they have to do. It's difficult to get people to do that. It's difficult to get such people elected in the current environment. Again, I just don't see an easy out on this. If I did, I'd be touting it, Jim. As I think I told you once, once you get beyond the point of being able to resolve the big problems in the system, what you have to look at is what you can do at an individual level, at least to protect yourself against all the craziness that the rest of the world's putting upon you. That's why I talk more about looking at preserving the purchasing power of your assets that are currently in dollars, wealth that's in dollars.
And that's something I think our listeners need to understand. No matter what their political persuasion, there is no stomach with politicians, and especially with an election cycle, to do what's right for the country. It's going to take somebody that comes from the private sector, not a career politician that says, I'm going to do what's right. I don't care. I have enough money. I've made it in the private sector. I don't need a government pension to take care of me in my old age. It's going to take that kind of person. But number two, that person also is going to have to be able to communicate in such a way that he can get elected. And you know what the media has done to Paul Ryan. You know what the media did to the president's own deficit commission.
Sure.
And that was bipartisan, which was amazing because it was the president that asked for it. There was an equal amount of Democrats and Republicans, and we had the group of six. I guess they're down to a group of five now. Even the group of six, they were all demonized. And I place a big blame, John, on the media. The media should know better. I mean, if Jim Poplava can look at the government's financial report and see that 80% of the budget deficit is untouchable because of entitlements, it doesn't take a math scientist to figure out, wait a minute, unless you touch this, you're never going to balance your books.
Yep. Well, the media has its own interest and includes ratings. The greater the crisis, you can brew the higher your ratings. I know there was an anchor on one of the popular financial programs a couple of years back who told me how he always rooted for stock market crashes. Yet all the stuff you'd hear that was put forth out of that network was usually very positive and very supportive of stocks. And I asked him why, and he said, "Well, we get great ratings when there's a stock market crash."
Yeah, everybody tunes in and wants to know what the heck's going on.
Everyone looks after his own self-interest. Unfortunately, this is a time when they have to realize that their self-interest goes beyond what is obvious. It's something that requires sacrifice, something that requires very deliberate and major action. Otherwise, it's going to be extremely painful for most everyone.
John, let me throw another one out there. You know, the politicians are politicians. They're going to try to kick the can down the road, and hopefully they're out of office collecting a pension, and it happens on somebody else's watch. But there's another constituency that we have today, you know, a bigger concern to us, and that's our creditors. We are a debtor nation, and foreigners own half our debt.
Yep.
So the reaction that from China, from India, from Brazil, from Europe, when the Fed announced QE2, that did not go over well with the rest of the world. QE1, everybody was in a crisis mode, so I think everybody just kind of overlooked that. But when we came back with QE2, and more likely QE3 in some form, how long is it before our creditors revolt and say, you know what, I'm sorry, but we ain't going to buy your paper anymore, which could trigger the very hyperinflation scenario that you're talking about. When nobody's there to buy our debt, that only leaves one entity, and that's the Fed.
Well, the Fed has actually been buying all the debt recently. In QE2, the total treasuries that it acquired under QE2 exceeded the net issuance of treasury debt for the public holdings. And the Fed effectively monetized more than the debt the government was issuing. Right now, you've got this argument over the debt limit, which is going to keep the borrowing from new borrowing by the government contained until maybe August, at which point it becomes a major crisis. So the pressure's not on the Fed right now to make the auctions go well. I mean, there'll be a rollover of debt, and they'll do whatever is needed to make sure the auctions go well. But I'll contend that the Fed's easing primarily is aimed at trying to provide solvency to the banking system. None of the crises that we faced a couple of years ago have been resolved. It's not over. We're still in crisis. And in terms of answering your question, it's just a matter of time before the foreign holder pull back from buying the dollar, and indeed the Fed becomes a lender of last resort to the federal government. The economy is flattened out this last month. If you look at most of the economic reporting in a month, it's actually turning down. And so I think probably come the third quarter, you'll see a QE3 of some form in place. It'll be covered by the weakness in the economy. At least that will be the Fed's cover. They'll say we're doing this to stimulate the economy. They will be saying we're doing this to try and keep the banking system afloat. But the crisis is still there, and if China said, look, we're going to dump our bonds, the Fed still doesn't have the choice. They're not going to let the system fail where they can step in and support it. So they'll support it until it becomes impossible to do so. At least that's the way I read their actions.
Yeah, and this brings up another question, because if you take a look at the last decade, baby boomers got hit with the tech bubble. They lost money in the tech bubble. 2008, 2009, another bear market in stocks. And to add insult to injury, this time their most valuable asset, their home, drops in value. Now, baby boomers, I read a figure, John, the other day, that since 2009, the net new money that has gone into mutual funds has been $47 billion. So they're not putting their money in the stock market. They're putting their money in the bond market. And let's talk about the risk, because they're about ready to get hosed again, because you follow the inflation numbers the way we used to report them.
Yep.
And I don't think anybody listening to this program, John, is buying the fact when Bernanke goes on public television and says, oh, you know, this stuff that's happening with oil and food, that's just temporary. We're very pleased that, you know, the core rate of inflation is under our target of 2%. I don't know anybody that lives on core inflation.
I don't either, even Mr. Bernanke. For obvious reasons, you can't live without food and energy. Right now, the CPI-U, which is the broadest inflation measures, I think it's around 3.2% year-over-year inflation. The narrower measure, the CPI-W, the wage earners inflation measure, is up at 3.6%. It's not going to be up quite as much this month because of a little pause in gasoline prices, but oil's headed a lot higher, the dollar's headed a lot lower. That inflation is going to continue to surge. We're going to be at 4 or 5% the next couple of months, but even where we are now,